So, um, see. All right, that advanced okay. So just a quick, background beyond just my current position, but I started out doing maple production actually when I was in grad school. And on the left-hand side, this little bottle of maple syrup was my first production ever, which was a very small amount of syrup, and I really rationed that throughout the year, that little tiny bit. I advanced a little bit more, started cooking all on the stove top with various, pans, spreading it out on all the different burners. Upgraded a little bit more to some bigger pans, and I was able to make probably close to 20 US gallons or so. Well, no, not that much. Take that back. I was only probably making 2 to 3 US gallons of syrup on a stovetop like that, but boiling from like 20 trees. It was a lot of work. And now I get to work on much bigger equipment. So I've worked in things all in between. So it's certainly a fun industry to be a part of. And I want to start out just thinking about how, the kind of the history of maple sugaring and how there's really this positive culture around maple, that most everybody loves maple. People enjoy coming to your sugar house and visiting for any activities, seeing the steam come off the evaporator and the boiling, doing sugar on snow, all those fun different activities. So it's really a great industry to be a part of, and people love to come and visit, something to do at the end of winter. So if we think about kind of how did maple get started, and we don't really know truly the actual beginnings, other than we know that it started with indigenous people in North America. And whether they found that out by boiling, or cooking a log in a fire that was burning in a fire, and that was still kind of wet with some maple sap in it, and saw that dripping out the end and the burnt, or maybe a broken branch from a tree that had a little, we call sapsicle, if anybody's ever seen these. They're tasty because they have that little bit of sugar in them. Somehow they figured that you can get sap from a maple tree, it's sweet, and you can boil that down. And so they were typically making these kind of more gashes and collecting it in little birch bark baskets and cooking that down in hollowed out logs, where they were putting hot rocks into that hollowed out log and taking them in and out as they cooled down and putting new ones. They were also most likely using some clay pots as well that were around at that time period to cook maple sap down. And so they taught all the European settlers to North America, who started producing maple sap as well. Before they had all the fancy spouts, they were using hollowed out logs, a lot of times from elderberry or sumac, because they usually have a hollow pith to them, so they worked really well. And with that, then eventually became the metal buckets that are kind of the iconic for the industry, and metal that could be used over an open fire for cooking that sap down in to syrup or into sugar, and then eventually some flat pans so you can spread out the surface area to cook down a lot faster. And so, lots of different ways for collecting it. Your traditional horse or oxen going out and collecting the sap from all the individual trees. But one thing about this is, if we think about collecting maple sap, we'll go over this in our presentation on Wednesday, is that buckets are great, and this is very iconic. There's still people who use draft horses and things to collect maple sap, but we do need to think about when we look at these pictures where there's snow on the ground, that's great. The ground's kind of more firm, but maple sap season is also oftentimes in our mud season as well. And so any type of equipment or animals can cause disturbance as we're moving, hundreds of pounds of heavy sap through our forest soils. And so with that, eventually people started becoming kind of innovative and thinking about how can we get that sap out of the woods without having to carry buckets as far or have equipment going through the woods. So this is a picture from a spot in the Adirondacks of New York, not too far from where I am, where it was this is the early 1900s, turn of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where this large commercial maple operation, one of the first large commercial maple operations that had about 80,000 taps all on buckets. But they had this pipe system to the woods where they had little ports where they could put a funnel every so often and dump the sap into, and then that would drain downhill to a collection tank And they actually were using narrow gauge and then eventually standard gauge rail lines to actually haul sap back to the sugar house. So a large investment at that time, but pretty innovative in the work that they were actually doing pre having any type of maple tubing. And if we think about kind of maple production 100 years ago or more, you know, pre-1900s, that most of the sap was boiled right down into sugar. They weren't actually making maple syrup. It wasn't until the early 1900s that maple syrup became more of a common thing to actually have. So if we think about 16, 17, 1800s, they didn't have a lot of containers to actually store maple syrup in. Also, syrup is not as shelf stable as sugar is. And so if you don't cook maple syrup to the correct density that we'll be going over eventually, then there's chances that it can spoil, or if you cook it too high, it's going to crystallize into big rock candies. So that's harder to use. And they didn't know necessarily at that time period what was the correct density for that. And they didn't have the instruments for measuring the final kind of finished density that we want for our maple syrup, which is 66 to 68.9% sugar. So it was easier for them. It stored better and was to cook it all the way down into sugar. And at that time period, it was actually cheaper than cane sugar. If you think about what were the forms of sugar at that time, honeybees are not actually native to North America. And so unless they had imported bees, they were getting cane sugar that was usually coming from slave-owned Caribbean islands, or slave not owned but slave-run sugar cane factory plantations in the Caribbean. And so it was much more expensive to transport that. So maple sugar was much cheaper than actually maple or traditional cane sugar at that time. And look at the prices for maple syrup, only $1.25 a gallon. So things have certainly changed, where if we look at what's the price of cane sugar or other sugars that we have in North America now, that they're not too far off of what the price of maple sugar was 100 years ago or more. So then if we look at kind of that production history cycle of maple sugaring across the US and Canada over the last 150 plus years, we can see that, you know, in the middle to late 1800s, especially within the US, was kind of a high point for syrup production. And even kind of Canada was increasing to the early 1900s, but then there was kind of a drop off, especially within the US, is that people kind of stopped producing maple syrup as much. People were moving to more urban areas, that people weren't farming quite as much in small little homesteading farms. And maple syrup was kind of flat and kind of dropped off. And it wasn't until kind of the late 1900s, early 2000s that we see, you know, since kind of 1990, that maple syrup production has really exploded. And this graph went to the more 2013, I believe. But if we expand onto that and extrapolate out, we can see that the industry has really skyrocketed in the last 20 to 40 years, which is kind of interesting and kind of exciting industry to be a part of right now, because that growth is quite rapid. But as we'll see, the consumer demand is still there. And this is what I have. So right now, Canada produces over 15 imperial gallons of syrup. The US is producing over 4 million imperial gallons of maple syrup. And so we look at the where is a room for growth, especially within Nova Scotia. And if we're looking at kind of the production since 2016 to 2020, this is from the MPAN's, their kind of strategic plan, that in 2020, Canada at large produced over 14 million gallons of maple syrup, almost 15 million gallons, where Nova Scotia was only 56,000 gallons. So quite a bit lower. There's definitely room for growth within Nova Scotia for maple syrup production. And if we look at consumers' standpoint, and that this is based on the US, but the and this is a little bit older too, but still standard for the US. The Canadian consumption of maple syrup is a little bit higher, but it's still quite low compared to other sugars in that, here within the US, we're consuming less than 1% of our sugar intake on average per person is less than 1% is coming from maple sugar. And so there's definitely room for growth when we think about that. Within Canada, I think it might be around 3% of sugar intake per person in Canada is maple syrup production. So even with that, it's better than what the US is doing, but there's still plenty of room for growth and for a market for maple syrup. And if we think about, why do we want to promote maple over other sugars, and that it is important, obviously, to recommend or recognize that maple, it is a sugar, and that sugar should be used in moderation. And there is oftentimes people refer to this kind of war on sugars, and that, a lot of people, health people recommend not to be using too much sugar. And so there's certainly moderation of sugars that we should be using. But when we think about the sugars that we are using, that maple is considered kind of the smarter sweetener to be using, because it does have some potentially added benefits, as in different antioxidants that are within that maple. Obviously, eating vegetables are going to be better ways to get some of those intakes, but if we're consuming a sugar, maple has these added components to it that make it a better than some of the other sweeteners that are out there. There's some different minerals and vitamins like riboflavin. There's a fair amount of calcium and things that are within our maple syrup compared to other sugars. And so besides those, there's different amino acids. There's as I mentioned, the minerals, vitamins. There's these polyphenols that are unique. Those are what make up your antioxidants, and there's ones that are unique to maple syrup alone that have not been found in other products. So that's kind of neat in that aspect. And some of you may have seen either this maybe past spring or summer or fall, this article that came out, or on some research that was done in Quebec looking at a clinical study of folks who had consumed maple syrup. And so it was kind of exciting in that this was the first clinical study of maple syrup consumption compared to other ones. There was one other clinical study for athletes, but just looking at normal human beings, they were fed, and it was only over an 8-week period where they were given 2 tablespoons of maple syrup a day. So not a really large volume of maple syrup. When you think about, if any of you who are maple syrup consumers, that's not all that much maple syrup. And the other part of the study was given 2 tablespoons of a flavored kind of syrup, sugar syrup, artificial syrup then. And then it was reversed after 4 weeks, and then the roles were switched to whether you're consuming the kind of the fake maple syrup, or not a fake maple syrup, but a fake sugary syrup versus the maple syrup, and found that there were actually some noticeable health benefits. So this is kind of the first study to truly show in humans that there may actually be some potential health benefits. We're always reluctant to say that maple is healthy for you because, again, it is a sugar, but they did find that it had a better blood sugar balance. There was some reduction in blood pressure, so some better cardiovascular impacts for maple syrup consumption, and it actually decreased abdominal fat a little bit. But again, used in moderation, but these are kind of some promising things that can help for kind of marketing maple syrup. But on the flip side, the New York State Maple Producers Association has done some market research over the last few years, and some case studies throughout different parts of the US in areas that are not traditional maple producing regions, but larger kind of urban areas, and finding that people are reluctant to be told that maple is a healthy for you or better sweetener, and that they still kind of consider that it's sugar. And so if they're consuming sugar, they're going to still consume what they want. So it depends on who you're marketing to, who you're advertising to. There may be other components that are important to kind of get across on some of the local aspects, or the aspects that, we're harvesting this product, the sap is coming from these native ecosystems. We're utilizing these forests that are sequestering carbon, they're filtering air, stabilizing our soil, but they're also providing wildlife habitat and songbird habitat. And so those can be important things to kind of market to the consumer as well. And so if we think about, why has maple syrup production really, drastically quadrupled or even more than that in the last few decades? And a lot of that goes back to that people do want kind of more local. They want food that they know where it came from, the kind of small scale gourmet products. They want to meet the farmer, and they want those more natural. And so, if we think about maple syrup, it's a single ingredient product versus you look at other, table syrups and things that are out there that have all these different chemicals or things and stabilizers and things that you can't necessarily pronounce, where if you look in the back of a bottle of maple syrup at the ingredients list, the only ingredient is maple syrup. And so that's an added benefit and another marketing strategy to think about. And I think that is really one thing that has helped the maple industry grow. Another thing that's helped the maple industry grow is that there's been a lot of new technology that allows us to make maple syrup production a little bit more efficiently and with the potential of potentially making a profit off it, where for many years, a lot of those maple production, in the mid 1800s when maple syrup production was really high, that was a lot of individual farms just doing it on a very small scale and just doing it as kind of something to do in the spring. Maybe they're going to sell a little bit to make some money, but they're not counting their time at all. They're going out and cutting firewood, but they're not counting that time. They're not counting all their time of collecting the sap and sitting around the evaporator waiting for that to boil. But they're doing it on a smaller scale, and they're maybe farmers, so there's not much to do that time of the year. It's kind of their downtime anyways, so that's okay. But now with this newer equipment, such as tubing, we don't have to go out and collect buckets of sap. The sap is transported down the line, so our collection tanks, so you can tap a lot more trees with fewer people. So you don't need a large army to go out there and tap all your trees. We're using vacuum pumps to increase our production from the trees that we have out there, so we're getting more sap per tree than what we used to. We're using more efficient equipment then to process that sap, such as using reverse osmosis machines, as in the bottom right hand corner that we'll go over, that filters out at least 50%, but even as high as 90% of the water, which means we're saving 50 to 90% of our time in boiling down our sap, so we're not standing around our evaporator as long, and also saves 50 to 90% of the energy that's needed to boil it down, which is a very, very significant savings in processing our sap into syrup. And then in our evaporators, they've become more efficient as well, so they don't require as much energy. And so all of this equipment and supplies cost money, but it saves on labor and saves on energy inputs, and so it helps increase production. And so now there are maple operations that can be a full-time business just doing maple syrup production or maple along with something else, and it can become profitable. And then if you think about, ways to be a little bit more profitable, when we think about the maple syrup market, there's really kind of 4 avenues for marketing your maple syrup. The first avenue is what's called the bulk industry, and that's you're producing your maple syrup and you're putting it usually into a large barrel. The standard is typically a 34-gallon stainless steel barrel, and then you're selling that to somebody who's buying, another producer or a packer who has large accounts that is buying maple syrup and bottling that and selling it to grocery stores or restaurants and things like that, or food manufacturing locations. So that's going to be your bottom line, the cheapest or the lowest price that you'll get for your maple syrup, but it has the lowest amount of inputs. Your second option is to wholesale your maple syrup. So wholesaling means typically that you're putting that into a retail container or a more finished container. So you are taking some time to bottle that out of your barrels, and you need to purchase those bottles, but then you're selling that to a store who's then going to mark it up and resell it. Your third option is to retail that maple syrup yourself. So you're putting it into your own containers, and then you're selling that directly to consumers. So now you have costs for the containers, for bottling, but also your time to go around to farmers markets or have people coming into your store or your farm, interacting with them, maybe giving them samples, but you're going to get the highest amount of value for that individual price of maple syrup, especially if you're selling it in smaller containers. And then the fourth one that I like to say is kind of a different one, and oftentimes most farms use a mixture of all of these four methods, is kind of what we call the value added marketplace. And so that's looking at all these different things that you see in the picture of what can I do with the maple and turn that maple syrup, do something else, add it to something else that adds even more value to it. So can I cook that down into a maple cream or a maple sugar, maple candies, kind of your standard confections that are going to be used for more things, or a maple butter, I think is actually how you traditionally would call that in Nova Scotia. And so, those are going to bring more of a value typically if you're doing it efficiently. So that's a great method to be using some of your products. And it's important to think about that as maple producers, we're really sap farmers. We're really harvesting sap. That's the product that we're actually harvesting. And what we do with that sap is up to us then. So, and we don't have to turn it all into maple syrup. We could take that sap and bottle it and sell it as a maple sap water or maple sap beverage. We can make maple sodas with that, with the sap water, or sap water and maple syrup if we're going to sweeten it, if we're going to do some maple sodas. I know Prenya has worked on some various recipes for some maple beverages over the last couple of years. So I'm sure Caitlin would be able to pass that information on to you if you're interested in that field. But then, other things beyond your standard maple confections is, maple cotton candy, as we can see in the picture on the right, where it's at this festival with this kind of little sugar house looking trailer, and there's a guy out there making maple cotton candy. That's a great way to really bring in some quick money at a festival with maple sugar. And it's usually not even straight maple sugar. It's usually 25% maple sugar with some cane sugar. Within our Cornell Maple program, we have a food scientist, Dr. Catherine Belisle, who's developed a recipe for maple marshmallows. As you can see in this toasted marshmallow picture, is like a gourmet marshmallow. So those are, great products as well. Maple pepper. The picture on the top left is actually a friend that I have in my area who's a maple syrup producer who purchased a kind of food trailer this spring and has been going around to fairs and festivals selling various maple products. So in that picture, he has maple ice cream machine in his trailer, and he makes these maple ice cream sundaes. And so there's little mini maple donuts with maple ice cream and maple cream on top, and maple sugar. So there's just lots of different maple, and they do everything maple, and have been doing really well with their food trailer. So there's lots of different innovative ways that you can do to create a profitable business if that's what you're looking for in maple, beyond just your standard maple syrup. So just take a little break right now and to get some participation going. I threw up this poll everywhere for those who have never used poll everywhere. So if you have a phone, you can either go on a web or you can go on your phone. On your phone, if you pull up your messaging app and just type in the number 37607, that's the number you would send to. And then in the body of the message, you would type Adam Wild 676 in the body of the message. You can send that message, and then you'll get a response saying that you're into that system. And then you can respond in the next message saying what's your favorite way to use maple syrup, and it should pop up here on the screen, or you can scan the QR code up here on the right, and that'll pull up a web app where you can do it right on there quite simply too. So if people want to do that, and then if you have any questions, feel free to jump in with any questions right now. We'll just pause for a minute. Got some oatmeal, some waffles coming in, all great choices. The classic pancakes. Coffee's always a good one. Sweetened tea, smoothies. Sausage. Nice. Yogurt, that's a favorite of mine. Blueberries. If you type 2 words, sometimes that breaks it up, unfortunately, in this word cloud. Any questions from anybody so far?
Yeah. If you have any questions, just make sure you raise your hand in the bottom or post them in the Q&A so that we can see.
All right, if there's no questions, we'll move on. And just to we'll use this the pull everywhere a little bit more for some more meaningful things coming up. So let's kind of move forward and think about what trees.
1 second, Adam. I think there's one question.
Oh, go ahead.
John, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak. Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I thought I'd be typing. That's why I wasn't ready to actually talk. But my question is basically, what about other syrups, like pine syrups or other trees too, not just maple syrup? Now, of course, well, I see it here. I see birch syrup. So you're probably just about to get onto that. So never mind.
That's a great question, John, and you brought that up right at the perfect time. Because that is our next topic here. The thing about what trees can we tap? So obviously we can tap maple trees for maple syrup production, but I wanted to kind of introduce the concept that there are other trees and other syrups that we can make. So obviously, this is more about maple syrup production, but I do want to mention if people have specific questions about these trees, I'd be happy to try to answer questions the best that I can. So one that I've actually experimented with over the last few years is tapping beech trees, the genus Fagus, and actually making beech syrup. For those, what I've found is that you have to have vacuum to actually get the sap from the trees. You can't just drill a hole and hang a bucket on the tree, but you need tubing and a vacuum system to basically pull the sap through the trees. It is low in sugar. It's around somewhere 0.5% to 1% sugar, which is quite low. And so it takes a lot more sap to make syrup out of it. That's where reverse osmosis comes into play. Obviously our maples we're familiar with. Birch is another one. My predecessor started tapping birch trees. Here we tap about 500 birch trees every year and make a birch syrup. The season for that's a little bit later in the year. Birch syrup is kind of right at the end of maples, after the maples are done. So for my area, which would probably be similar for Nova Scotia, that's somewhere around late April to the first week or so of May. And we're tapping both the white birch, or also called the paper birch, Betula peperifera, and our yellow birch is what we have natively within our forest in the Adirondacks. The flavor on this is more like a balsamic reduction. So it's a very different flavor overall. So it's not something that you'd maybe want, on those things we just had in the word cloud, like waffles and yogurts and pancakes and tea, or your coffee. But it's, if you think about more savory foods, things you'd use balsamic for. So on a piece of salmon or other fish or even chicken or pork, I really like it on like fresh tomato, mozzarella, and basil, or even on sandwiches or wraps. It's good with roasted vegetables. Make like a white pizza with it. So it has a lot of unique uses. Think more balsamic vinaigrette. It's tart. It's strong flavor. Our beech syrup is closer to maple. It's different than maple, but it's not too far off from maple, where our birch is very different. Another one I threw up here is box elder syrup, which is actually maple. So that's really is part of the maple. Tastes a little bit different from maple when I've had box elder syrup. So Acer negundo is our scientific name for the box elder tree, which is isn't actually a maple. So when I've had it, it tastes a little bit like honey, but it's still rather tasty. And there are places out in like Manitoba where they don't have our traditional sugar maples and red maples, so they actually top box elders and make box elder syrup instead. Other ones would be walnut trees. Probably don't have too many walnuts in Nova Scotia or any at all. I don't have any in the Adirondacks either, but I'll just I kept that in there just to think about that. That is one that's more popular in parts of kind of the southeastern US where they have more walnut trees. The sugars are higher, but the sap volume is low, but it makes a syrup that's fairly close to maple, but has a little bit of a nutty flavor. It's pretty good, but it has some challenges in collecting that sap as well. So that's those are some of the a few of the different trees that can be tapped. I like to play with, one advantage of tapping these different trees is that, we're able to utilize the land for more than just maples, so if you have a pocket of your forest that has a bunch of birch or other, species or a bunch of beech, then maybe it's worth you tapping those if you don't have a lot of maple, or to do both, and that creates more product diversity if you're going to different markets as well then. So moving on then, thinking about our different types of maples, and I see there's a question just came in on reds versus sugar maples, so we'll cover that. And there's over 100 different species of maples across the world. The most common that we have in Eastern North America that we're tapping for syrup production because the sugar levels that they have are high, and also their density within our upland forest are high as well. So the sugar maples and our red maples are most common that we're going to be tapped. On the left here is a sugar maple, traditionally in the fall color. It has yellow to orange leaves. In our red maple on the right hand side is why it gets the name red maples, because in the fall the leaves are red, although they can sometimes be yellow to orange as well, but most of the time they're red. If we're thinking about just some real basic principles for tree identification, if we look at the leaf attachment on a maple tree or on any trees, in that they're usually either alternate or they're opposite. And if we look at the branching as well, we see that they're either opposite or they're alternate branching on the fine branches as well. When the branches get bigger, sometimes the branches fall out, so that's not always true, but on the fine branches, they'll be opposite. And so on our maples, maple trees are opposite, and there's less trees in our forest that are opposite. Other example of an opposite is an ash tree. So that's one you do want to look out for, but ash trees have these pinnately compound leaves. So this is one individual leaf, has all these little tiny, what we call leaflets. So that's an ash tree is different when it has leaves like that. So our maples have opposite branching, where our birch and our beech trees are all alternate branching, and for the leaves and the branches then. So if we're looking at how do we identify a sugar maple versus a red maple outside of the fall color, our sugar maple that we have on the left hand side has these pointed buds. And if you look carefully, there's little tiny scales, kind of like little fish scales. There's lots of little scales. It's hard to see in this picture because they're really small buds, but they are sharply pointed, versus on our red maple. Another reason why a red maple is called a red maple is because the buds are red. And you notice here that there's less scales. There's only a few scales usually, and it's more pointed. More blunt, more rounded over. It's not as pointed as our sugar maple is here. And then we're looking at the leaves of our sugar maple versus the red maple. They're both going to be red in the summertime. I cannot talk tonight. Green in the summertime. Our red maple has lots of little serrated teeth along the outside edge of the leaf, what we call the margin, where our sugar maple has points kind of at the tips of the veins, but doesn't have all the little serrated teeth around the outside. Also, if we look at the cutout area, what we call the sinus on a leaf, on a red maple, it's a sharp point like a V, where on our sugar maple, it's rounded U, like the U in sugar, if that helps you remember. And then if we look at the bark is a hard way to kind of tell a sugar versus a red maple, but sugar maple has become a little bit more, has more ridges, what we call more furrowed, versus a red maple has very smooth bark when it's younger. Sugar, when it's really young, will be smooth as well, but starts to get more ridges when it a little bit quicker than the red maple does. And then here's an older red versus sugar maple, where the sugar maple here has all these deep kind of ridges, furrows on it, whereas our red maple bark is a little bit thinner and a little bit more flaky, especially at the tops and bottoms. It kind of starts to flake up a little bit. And so if we think about which, is there any advantage or disadvantage to tapping either of these? And historically, people have avoided tapping the red maples for a long time. And that was because they were thought to have lower sugar within their sap and didn't produce as well. So a lot of people would avoid tapping red maples. But a lot of that was anecdotally. There wasn't a lot of good research on that. But there has been some more recent research looking at that and actually found that red maples are usually a little bit lower in sugar, but it's not that much lower. And with reverse osmosis, that's less kind of important and still important. When we look at the total volume that's produced from those trees, that red maples actually a lot of times will produce a little bit more sap than the sugar maple will. So if we look at the total syrup production from a red maple versus sugar maple, they're about the same pretty much. And so it's just as good to tap a sugar maple as it is a red maple. And as far as flavor, University of Vermont did recently some production of pure red maple syrup and pure sugar maple syrup cooked on the same day in the same type of equipment, concentrated with a reverse osmosis the same way, and found that, then did a blind taste test with participants and found that there really wasn't a difference between the red maple versus a sugar maple. There was a detectable difference, I think, the last sample of the year, but it wasn't a bad difference. It was just different, but still great maple syrup. So that's our red versus our sugar maples. And if we just look at our distribution, both of them are all throughout Nova Scotia. So that's the important part for what we're going over today. Red maples have more of a distribution. One advantage of red maples is they typically grow on a little bit more extreme sites, where sugar maples are kind of a little bit more picky in that they want kind of moist soils, but very well drained. They don't want it too wet. They don't want it too dry. They need lots of nutrients. Red maples will grow on wet soils, and they'll also grow on some drier soils. And so they have a little bit more tolerance and a little more diversity and spread that way. Some other maples that you may come across out there, the Norway maple, which is a non-native maple, but planted in landscapes a lot of times and can sometimes spread into kind of edges of forests and areas. The Norway maple has a leaf similar looking to a sugar maple. It's a little bit wider usually. One thing to look for, and if you pull off the base of the leaf, what we call the petiole, the base of the little stem of the leaf, you'll have this white milky sap there oftentimes. If you squeeze it a little bit, the bark's not that deep furrowed ridges. That's what I call more of a corky. It's kind of soft with these smoother-ish bark. And the buds are more rounded over. They're not pointed like our sugar maples, and a little more purple versus our red maples were more red. They were rounded over as well. These are fatter, plump buds. And then a silver maple. Silver maples usually grow along stream banks. They are a native on eastern North America, but they're usually not in high density areas, so they're not tapped as often. They are sometimes planted in landscapes. They're usually lower in sugar, although I've tapped silver maples that have been higher in sugar if you get a nice big open grown kind of lawn tree. The buds are sort of like red maples, except they're more clustered and the bark's even more flaky. And if we look at the leaves, they're silver on the underside. That's where the name comes from. And they have these really deep cutouts in the sinus area. So those are kind of a just brief tree identification and different trees we can tap. And one thing I just want to mention is that, if you're thinking about getting into maple, if you're not currently a maple producer, is you can be a maple producer without having to have all the equipment. If you just want to hang some buckets on your trees or maybe put up some tubing, you can do that without needing to have an evaporator. But if you have somebody nearby who has an evaporator, that potentially you can bring that sap to them, and they can either buy it from you as raw sap, or they can boil that down, and then they will give a portion of that back to you as finished maple syrup that you can use to consume yourself, give to friends and family, or if you even want to sell that as well. So I actually have a couple of different producers, and that's what this picture here is of a couple in my town who tap actually almost 1,000 maple trees, and their friends help them. They're retired, and they have retired friends who come and help them tap their trees and collect the sap, and then they bring the sap to our Cornell facility. It gets downloaded into our tanks, we boil it down, and then they get about 2/3 or about 60% of that back as finished maple syrup, and we keep about 40% as kind of payment for processing that maple syrup. It's all blended together. We don't separate that out in our production, but we keep track. They record the sap sweetness and the volume that they're bringing, and then I can calculate out how much syrup that would actually make. So that's something to keep in mind. Happy to answer questions on any of that, but don't think that you have to go out and purchase all the equipment that we'll be going over. So just to throw out another poll, how many trees do you plan to tap this coming year, this spring? See if you want to jump on there. You don't have to type in the Adam Wild 676 again on your phone. If you're doing the text message or on the web, you can just go open it back up, and it should still be live. You can just punch in your answer and show the responses here.
And I think there is one other question in the chat there. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read that
So
one.
there's a question asking about how can I get jobs? I live outside of Canada. So I guess the question would be how to get a job in the maple industry within parts of Canada, I would assume is the question. In that sense, usually larger maple producers will sometimes are looking for people to work within their operations. And so for that, it's usually if you can kind of search for some of the larger maple producers in a region that you want to work and reach out to them directly, or reach out to a maple producing association. So in Nova Scotia would be MPANS, the Maple Producers Association of Nova Scotia, and they might be able to contact you with somebody who's looking to hire in a maple operation. I don't know, Caitlin, does Perennia do any kind of work placement work at all with farms?
Not really. I think the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture might be able to help more with that. We can look into it though. If it's something that you're interested in, you can always send me an email. And just while I'm talking, I have been putting a few things in the chat. I think people can see that, just information where the maple information is on the Cornell website and the Perennia website, as well as the registration. But yeah, you can reach out to Perennia and we can put you in contact with the Federation of Agriculture, and they might be able to help you find work in Nova Scotia at least.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. So looks like we've got a real diversity of what people are looking to tap, anywhere from 5 trees, 10, 100, 240, 20, 30, to a couple people looking to do 1,000. So that's great. We got quite a variety of operations that are out there. So another poll for you is, what is the average sap sweetness of a sugar maple tree growing in a forest? So what's typically the percent sugar of a percent sugar in the sap of a sugar maple tree growing in a forest? And I say growing in a forest because trees that are usually growing in a yard, if they have a bigger canopy, more open areas, less competition, can have much sweeter sap typically in that sense. So in a forest, we have tighter canopies. There's more competition. Trees are growing together, so their canopies are kind of competing for light. So if we have less leaves on a tree, if we think about our leaves as little factories for producing sugars, so the more leaves, more little factories for producing sugars through photosynthesis in our growing season, typically the sweeter that sap will be. But in our forest, we're typically on average fairly similar in range. It does depend on the region, so I'll go ahead and show the responses here. They're coming in. So we've got 1.5 to 2, 2, 1.8. Generally, colder regions have a little bit sweeter sap than areas that are warmer. And that has to do with sugars are kind of part of a antifreeze within the trees in the wintertime. So colder weather triggers enzymes to convert the starch that are stored in sugars into sucrose, which is the sugars that we're collecting during the maple season. And so if you get colder weathers, you usually get more of that starch conversion to sucrose. The sap will be a little bit sweeter. And also in warmer regions, the trees aren't respiring as much in the dormant season because the winters stay cold and they don't burn up. Even, we get it, the leaves are off, which means those trees are actually burning up some of our stored sugars as they're alive. They're respiring. Do you have something to say, Caitlin? I saw you unmuted. Did I break up for a little bit?
Yeah, I think you just paused for a second, but we have you back now.
All right, great. So yeah, so that's something to think about too, is that, in these dormant seasons, if the leaves are off, the plants are still alive, so they're actually going to be burning up some of that stored sugar. So most of you are pretty close. That generally we say roughly around 2%, 1.8 to 2.25% sugar on a maple tree in the forest is pretty average, but trees that are growing in your lawn can be as high as 4, 5, even 6% occasionally. So with that in mind, so what's kind of in maple sap? So if it's 2% sugar, what else is in that sap? And the remaining, primarily remaining 98% is mostly water. But there are also, as we mentioned before in maple syrup, there's all these different minerals and nutrients. So there are natural antioxidants from the polyphenols, and there's electrolytes, and there's all the different minerals that are within that maple sap. They're all in trace volumes that are there, but it's primarily water with just that little bit of sugar. And so lots and lots of water within that. And as I mentioned before, you can bottle maple sap and sell it as a beverage because there are kind of these natural electrolytes and antioxidants and things that you can market. You can play on a lot of kind of current marketing trends such as gluten-free, vegan, paleo. I've seen maple sap advertised as having more potassium than a cup of kale. So thinking about these kind of health food trends, that kale is supposed to be healthy, right? But if we can play on some of that this is supposed to be better. Maple sap is usually marketed against coconut water. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the flavor of coconut water, but I love drinking maple water. I drink it in the maple season all the time. And if you actually look at taking all the sap that it takes to boil down into maple syrup, if you took the amount of sap it would take to make, say, a gallon of maple syrup and put that into individual, bottles, such as in this one here, this 500 milliliter bottle, and sold that for $4 a piece, you would be bringing in probably around $1,000 versus if you boiled all that sap down to make a gallon of syrup and maybe you put that into some smaller 250 milliliter, 500 milliliter bottles and sold it, maybe it'd bring $150. So, and you don't have to boil it down. But it is a product that can spoil, so there has to be a pasteurization method, and then the market chain for that can have some challenges. But hopefully this will continue to be a growing trend in the maple industry. One thing neat about drinking maple sap, it's actually not unique to North America. People in Korea have actually been drinking maple sap for many years as well. They usually don't make maple syrup there, but they tap the trees in the mountains and drink the Garosa sap, which is our native maple, the Garosa maple, as kind of a spring tonic. There's been actual studies in labs looked at in mice and rats and found that it increased bone strength. They fed mice or rats maple sap versus spring water or distilled water and found that it had much more calcium, there was more potassium, and it helped with the bone strength. And there was even a study where they got a bunch of rats drunk somehow, and they then fed them after they got them drunk, gave them maple sap versus spring water and distilled water, and somehow, I'm not sure how you measure the hangover cure in a rat, but somehow they were able to measure that rats that had maple sap after getting drunk fared better, had less of a hangover than ones just drinking water. So kind of interesting concepts out there. That's a good way to market to college students, I guess. So another poll here, what's the ratio of sap to syrup if your sap sweetness is an average of 2%? So here you can just do A, B, C, D, or E. Just type in A, B, C, D, or E into the poll and it'll come up. If anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. Quite a few people saying 40 to 1, but we've got some people saying 20 to 1. Nobody's saying 5 to 1 or 60 to 1 yet. Oh, we got a 60 to 1 choice. All right, so the correct answer is what the majority chose here. C is on average about 40 to 1. And so there's a rule that we use for calculating the ratio of sap to syrup. The old rule was called the Jones rule of 86. And you take the number 86 and divide it by your percent sap sugar that you have, and that'll be your ratio of sap to syrup. So in here, if we had 86 divided by 2%, on our average, it's 43 to 1 for our ratio of sap to syrup. So depending on what your sap sugar is, that's that ratio, and that's how much water you need to boil off to make syrup from that. More recently, it was kind of discovered that this isn't the most accurate. It gets you pretty close, but in the ballpark, but it's not quite on. So there's a new rule where we use 87.1 divided by your percent sap sweetness. And if you want to be real technical, then you subtract 0.32 from that answer to get your ratio of sap to syrup. So we really should be using more like 87 or even 88 divided by your percent sap sugar. And this is 87.1 is based on a density of syrup at 66.0%. And again, the standard of identity for maple syrup in Canada and the US, in Nova Scotia, would be 66.0 to 68.9. So if you're cooking that syrup a little bit higher to around 67%, then you should be using 88 to divide by your percent sugar. So you're actually more around 43.5, 44 of a ratio if you're at 2%. So we think about this in practical kind of example. So 87.1 divided by 2 minus our 0.32 is 43.2. And so that's to make, a gallon of syrup, or you could say 43 liters of syrup to make 1 liter of syrup. But if we increase, if our sap sugar, so why it's better to have maybe those trees in your yard that are a little bit higher, that have say 3% sugar in the sap. If we do that math, now where it only takes about 29 to 1. So that's a lot less water that needs to be boiled off in order to make syrup. Or if we have the same volume with higher sugar in one, we're going to make a lot more syrup out of, the higher sugar than we are versus the lower sugar sap. So having higher sugar is definitely great. But on the flip side, it is harder to control that, but there are some things that we can do to try to manipulate that a little bit. So if we think about kind of the physiology of sugars within a tree and thinking about sap flow, so I already mentioned that our sugars are being produced through photosynthesis in our growing season. So what's really important in our forest is not what's really happening during our maple season. That's important for our sap collection, but we need to think about the whole entire year, the whole entire calendar year in our growing season. What's happened this past summer? You know, did we have a great growing season? Do we have a good amount of sun and the right amount of water? We have good nutrients in our soils that allowed our trees to photosynthesize and produce a lot of sugars. And so when trees are photosynthesizing, they're taking in the sunlight, they're taking in carbon dioxide and water, they're producing oxygen, they're producing glucose. Some of that glucose is going to be used right away for growth, for respiration, and some of it will be converted into starch and be stored for long term. And our maple trees are trees that like to store a lot of sugar, and that's usually stored as that starch. And I put this picture of a solar panel in here because I like to think about maple leaves as basically just thinking about it as these individual solar panels, or as I said before, these factories that are making the sugar. So the more we have of them, the more solar panels we have, the more energy we can produce. Our sugar is our energy. So what's required for us to be able to collect that sap and the sugars from our trees? And most of you are probably familiar that we need that freezing and thaw cycle during the dormant time of the year. And what actually happens if we're looking, step back a little bit and think about the internal anatomy of our tree stem, where we have our bark. The inner layer of our bark is made up of the phloem. The phloem, not to get too scientific about this, but this is where typically in the growing season, our sugars are transported throughout the tree. So if we're producing sugars up in the leaves, then they're transported through the sap in the phloem, where our wood, which is made up of all xylem, is where water and nutrients are transported. That's during the growing season. But during the dormant season of the year, the sugars are actually transported and stored in the xylem. So when we're tapping a maple tree, we're actually drilling past the bark, past the inner layer bark, which is our phloem, into the xylem, to the wood of the tree, and that's where we're actually getting those sugars. So all those sugars are being stored in the xylem, and that's where we're getting. And they're stored there because it acts as a freeze defense mechanism. So the tree doesn't totally freeze solid and crack and split in the cold winters. That also, the way the cells work in a tree, and it filters out the water, creates this purified water that's not able to form these ice particles that can attach together, prevents a tree from freezing as well. But the sugars are also there because in the spring, when it starts to warm up, the buds want to swell. The buds on the tree want to swell and open up the flowers, and then our leaves on our maple trees. So those sugars are there to be transported through the xylem up into the fine branches and the buds of the tree. So that's where all those sugars. So it's important to understand that we're getting it from not from the phloem and the edge of the inside layer of the bark, but we're getting it from inside of the wood when we're looking at our tap holes. So if we think about the actual sap flow in a real basic, simplified, and we don't fully understand every aspects of sap flow. We understand the main kind of components a little bit. But what has actually happened when it, if we have a day that thaws out and then it drops and goes into a freezing at night, typically at night, doesn't have to be, but if it freezes, what's happening is there's actually a vacuum that's created in the tree, and that allows the tree to pull in groundwater. So there's negative pressure that's created up in our branches and our trunk, and tree water that's in sap that has the sugars in the trunk moves up into the fine branches, which then allows the tree to pull in groundwater. That groundwater is picking up all of our stored sugars in our roots, in our trunk, and in our branches of the tree. And then when it thaws out, so if the next day if it thaws out, or the next time when it does get above freezing, there's actually positive pressure created within that tree that pushes that sap back down. And if we have a tap hole within our tree, that sap is actually pushed out into our bucket or our tubing. And so if we look at this image on the left, This is a tree that has gone into vacuum mode. So here's zero pressure. If it goes to the right, the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 going around, that's pounds per square inch of pressure, where on the left is actually negative pounds per square inch of pressure. So it's in this negative 10 psi, this vacuum that's allowing that tree to pull in that groundwater to recharge the trees with sap, so that when it thaws out the next time, the trees go into this pressure mode. And as we see here, this one goes from 0 up in kind of around, say 11 o'clock, 10, 11 o'clock is 0. But this is all the way over to 25 pounds per square inch of pressure inside that tree, which is not uncommon to have 20 to 25 psi within a tree when it first thaws out, which is pretty amazing if you think about, like, that's almost your car tire pressure inside that maple tree. And so the reason why that sap naturally wants to come out of that tap hole in a maple tree is that the atmospheric pressure is less than what the pressure is inside that tree when it thaws out and sap is flowing. And so if we have our bucket, it'll drip out into there. If we use vacuum, we create even a kind of artificial negative vacuum in our atmosphere now inside of our tubing. So vacuum on a tubing system that we'll talk about on Wednesday helps us to increase production, because the gradient between the pressure in that tree and the negative pressure now in that tubing allows even more sap to flow out. And especially if you had a day where it didn't freeze overnight, and so it's flowing for a couple days, eventually that pressure within that tree kind of deflates as that sap kind of works down the tree. Some of it can push back out the roots, goes into our tubing or a bucket. And so the pressure kind of deflates in that tree. And so at the end of a couple of days of running, if it hasn't frozen again and recharged the tree with more sap to repressurize it, then we won't have as much flow out of our tree. But with the vacuum, it'll allow us to continue to collect sap from those trees. And so it's kind of amazing to think about this pressure difference. And maples are a little unique in the way that they actually do this. It's what we call stem pressure that's created. In our birch trees, it's a root pressure. That's why it's later in the year. It's because the weather has thawed out and the trees are just pushing the sap up. The trees are opening up the buds, and that's the sap that we're actually collecting. It's not the freeze-thaw cycle. Warmer weather on birch trees usually yield better sap. And so think about this just a little bit in a very simplified, it doesn't go into full detail. If we were to zoom in on one of those branches where we actually have these little CO2 bubbles that are within the tree, what happens is when that gets cold, those constrict down. That creates less pressure, more volume space for sap that's over in our deeper, thicker branches into inner part of the wood where it hasn't frozen yet. That sap can move then and freeze in the higher branches. It also has to do with when it gets colder, that sap is pulled between layers of the cells. And then when it thaws out, that gas expands, and that's going to push that sap back, down that branch, down the stem, and into our bucket then. So I'm going to play this time-lapse video that my colleague produced that actually shows sap flow over a couple day period. So if we look at this graph, this analog dial gauge here, this is kind of like those pictures that I just showed that was measuring the pressure or the vacuum, the positive and negative pressure inside the maple tree. So where it's pointing right now in the still image is, I believe that's 0 pressure. If it goes to the right, it's a positive pressure. If it goes left, it's going to be in a vacuum stage. And we'll compare that as this time-lapse video goes against the temperature in the bottom left corner of the digital screen. The top big numbers, the 750 is the time of day. So it's 7:50 in the morning. It's 29.3 degrees Fahrenheit. This is done in Fahrenheit. And then the 99%, I believe, is probably relative humidity or something like that. And then we also have a drop line with a spout with a drop line coming into this bucket. He dyed the sap blue to make it look like this would be easier to see in the camera. but you'll notice it's a little bit harder to see, but you will see the sap bucket fill up a little bit. Pay less attention to that. Look more at the pressure change as the temperature changes in this video. So we'll go ahead and start this here. So we'll notice we're getting up to 32, 34, and there we go. The pressure jumped up as it's thawed out. Got above 30 degrees, a freezing point. The bucket's filling up on the tree. It's almost full of sap. Sun's starting to set. It's in the evening now. The temperature's dropping to 32. Pressure is going down. And there, all of a sudden, it goes into vacuum mode. Actually, I think the 12 o'clock would be the zero pressure. So it's still in a vacuum mode. But as it gets really cold, the vacuum backs off a little bit. It's when it really dips below that. There goes the moon setting down. It's 21 degrees now. Sun's coming up. Takes a little bit to warm up, but we're up to 33, 36. Pressure should jump up here pretty soon. There it goes. If you have any questions about sap flow, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box. Now we're dipping back into freezing. You can see the pressure has dropped down, and then there it goes into vacuum mode again. And it's important to realize, I guess, that, I mean, these numbers don't line up perfectly because this is measuring the air right here. It's not measuring the air temperature of what's happening in the canopy and the whole part of the tree. So it might fluctuate a little bit, you know, just because you're measuring at one point, but doesn't mean what's happening in other parts of the tree. So the question Scott has is that gauge just inserted into a tap hole, and that's basically all it is. There's a piece of tubing that's connected to a traditional just maple spout, so there's a 5/16 hole that's tapped into the tree. Do that. So if you wanted to get a positive negative gauge, you can throw that on a tree, you know, near your sugar house or near your house, whatever. And it is kind of cool to watch the fluctuations, especially if you get a lot of people coming to visit your sugaring operations. It's great kind of teaching during the maple season to show, you know, well, look at the pressure in the tree, or look, it's in vacuum right now, or it's kind of really frozen up. So there's not really any pressure or vacuum, but it's not too hard to set up within that. Sometimes you can get where, if it truly freezes a little bit of sap in that line, that the sap will freeze and expand and create an artificial pressure when it should be more in vacuum. The analog gauges don't typically do that. I have that issue more with digital ones that I've been trying to play with. So great question, Scott. So hopefully that helped kind of visualize and understand that pressure gradient that happens within a tree. Go ahead. So if you think about how much sap can we actually collect from one tree within a season, and it varies on climate and weather and the size of the tree that you have, the health of the tree. But generally we say, you know, without vacuum, so if you're just putting a bucket on a tree or some tubing that's doesn't have any vacuum with that, you're probably within a season going to have somewhere between 7 to 10. That doesn't mean you can't get more, but 7 to 10 gallons. And I forgot to convert this to imperial gallons. That's US gallons, but it'd be pretty similar for imperial gallons with that. You know, it's not, you can still, if you have a nice big healthy yard tree, you can get more sap, and that's with from one spout. If you've got a really big tree that you're putting more taps into, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, you might get a little bit more. But with vacuum, we can usually double production. So usually 15 to 20 US gallons, so maybe somewhere around 12 to 18 imperial gallons with a vacuum system, if a high vacuum system. I see that there's a question from Steve asking, based on my tree diagram, could one tap a tree above an old tap, say 5 to 6 inches above an old tap? So if we had a tree and we had an old tap hole and we tapped right above it, 5 to 6 inches, I mean, you can drill that hole, but you're not going to usually get good sap. We'll go into this a little bit more on Wednesday. I'll show some diagrams, but when trees are tapped, after the growing season, or sorry, after the maple season, once it gets into the growing season, trees do what's called compartmentalization, where they form these walls and create this non-conductive wood that sap does not flow through. And it's this little column that's as wide as the tap hole, but it will go oftentimes 8 to 10 inches above or below an old of that tap hole. So if you go 5 to 6 inches above it, you're going to hit that non-conductive wood that's not transporting any sap, and you're probably not going to get any sap from that hole. If you use a vacuum system, it'll also be a vacuum leak. So you don't want to do that. You want to shift over. You can maybe go 2 to 3 feet above a hole, but ideally we want to shift over, and we'll go over that a little more on Wednesday. So I see a couple of questions that lead right into my next slide. Is, does tapping hurt a tree? And so the questions from Alex and Jillian that I see are, referring to tapping that much, especially with vacuum. Can that be harmful to a maple tree? And to date, we have not seen any harmful effects to the tree's overall health and growth, even with the high vacuum. I mean, maple trees have been tapped for hundreds of years. Some of the same trees, the Cornell Forest where I work, we've been tapping some of the same trees here. I myself have not been, but some of the same trees since 1965. They weren't always as high a vacuum, but they were using vacuum basically since the beginning. And we're still tapping some of those same trees. The University of Vermont has been doing a study for over 10 years, monitoring trees that were tapped with vacuum, some without vacuum, and then trees that were not tapped at all in some different locations. They've been doing it for over 10 years and not seen a difference on kind of growth within the trees as an indicator for kind of health. So, if a tree's healthy, it's going to be growing. They're not seeing any side effects from that. Obviously 10 years though for a maple tree is really a very small blip in time, where you really need to be doing that for 50 or 100 years to get a better understanding. But at this point, we don't think that there's any side effects or harm that's done to the trees. They still seem to be healthy. They still seem to be growing. And as we'll talk about on Wednesday in tapping, it is really important to make sure that we're producing enough new healthy wood year after year within those trees to continue tapping. The analogy I like to use is that tapping a tree is like donating blood, that as long as you're healthy, you can, build back blood, you can donate a little bit, where same with a maple, as long as that tree's healthy. There have been studies that have looked at the total kind of carbohydrate pool, the energy pool within the tree, which is part of, that's what we're pulling from. And a maple tree on average, we're taking about 5% of their stored carbohydrates. And maple trees as a species, especially sugar maples, store a lot of extra carbohydrates. And so we're only taking a small percentage of that from the tree. That being said, we learn more and more from plants that, different kinds of injuries cause them to have different reactions or release different aerosols, and that allow them to communicate with other plants around them. There hasn't been anybody looking at that within maple trees, so we don't know that exactly. Darren threw in a question asking, what's the difference if you have a large slope? Can you get a larger flow? And that question's a little bit more complicated. If you do have a large long slopes, a lot of elevation drop. If you use, kind of in the short thing without getting too much into tubing and sap collection, if you use smaller diameter tubing, 3/16 diameter tubing, and if you have an airtight system and that sap drops over a long distance, it can actually create its own vacuum that'll allow more sap to be pulled without using a vacuum pump. The analogy I like to use is like taking like a thin plastic water bottle or milk jug or something, filling that up with water, especially warm water, and tipping it upside down. And if you've never noticed where the sides like suck in, or as it's trying to release that water out because it's not getting air, as it's dumped straight upside down until it does the chug thing. And so that's the vacuum that we can create, that same concept. And so we can get more sap in that case. Or if you use the more traditional 5/16 tubing, if you get enough trees, I found if I can get 25-30 trees on a really long distance, dropping at least 30-40 feet in elevation, I can create vacuum and increase production as well. The issue with the 3/16 is that over a few years it can potentially plug up and get dirty, and that will restrict sap flow and actually cut down on production. So you need to make sure that you're doing a sanitation method on that the tubing so that it doesn't plug up and restrict flow. But as long as it's sanitized, it can be a great way to gather maple sap if you've got nice slope without needing to invest in a vacuum pump. So we'll hit on that a little bit more on Wednesday. As far as with vacuum, if you're putting a vacuum pump on it though, slope really shouldn't make too much of a difference in increasing production, as long as your sap on a flat ground is not kind of bellying out, getting any dips or sags where sap would build up and prevent vacuum flow, or cause the sap to freeze when it gets cold and then not get vacuum later on as that sap's waiting to thaw out. Another question from Yannick asking, does the orientation of your tap, north, south, east, west, have an effect on results? Ultimately, no. That is kind of an old theory that you want to tap the tree on the south side because that's going to thaw out first and flow the best. Ultimately, it doesn't matter across the season. If you tap on the south side, it's probably going to flow a little bit earlier in the season or flow earlier in the day, but it's also going to end sooner in the season and end sooner in the day. So throughout the grand scheme of the whole maple season or the whole day of sap flow, it typically doesn't matter. Maybe you can get some slight differences. The important thing though is it goes back to, we want to make sure we're tapping in a clean wood. And so if you're always tapping on the south side or always tapping on the east side of a tree, then you're going to run out of spots of clean wood to tap into on those trees. So it's best to be moving around a tree on all sides to get good wood to tap into. And so in general though, it doesn't affect production on which side that you tap. Great questions. Feel free to throw some more questions into there or raise your hand. I'm just going to go over some kind of questions for you, questions to ask yourself before starting a sugaring operation, if you're new into sugaring or just getting started or thinking about starting. And then we can go over some more questions that you have for me. And so with that, things to think about is, how much time do you have? How much time can you dedicate out of your day? So how many trees, what type of equipment to make it more efficient or less efficient? How much time do you have to actually be a maple producer? Do you like collecting sap and making syrup, or is it more of a chore? It should be enjoyable for you to do. Life is short. There's lots of things you can do in the world. So is it something you enjoy doing? Or do you like just collecting sap, working in the woods, but you don't actually enjoy the boiling? So maybe you want to tap trees and then bring that sap to somebody else, as I mentioned. Or maybe you like all the equipment in the sugar house, but you don't like the woods. So maybe you want to partner up with somebody who wants to work in the woods and you do the boiling. How many trees do you have access to? That's always important to think about when you're sizing out your operation, the equipment that you need. So thinking about how much sap you might get from those trees within the area. And then how will this sugaring kind of fit into your lifestyle and your family life? It goes back to how much time do you have, but how does that work within your family? Is it something that your family is all going to be involved with, or do you have friends? This is a community. Are you tapping trees on your neighboring property, or are people in your community tapping trees? This happens in many places where even in kind of more suburban or sort of urban areas where people might have 2 or 3 trees in their backyard or on their along the street that they're tapping in a neighborhood and bringing the sap to one person who has a little evaporator and boil, and everybody gets a little syrup back, or it's a way to kind of hang out when the weather's starting to warm up and as a neighborhood. So how does that kind of fit into what are you hoping for? What are you trying to get out of it within your lifestyle? What equipment do you already have that you can utilize? And do you have any kind of tanks or barrels or buckets that are food grade that you could use for collection? Do you have something to boil down on? It's important to think about. how many people are willing and available to help. So, you know, who in your family is going to be helping you, or friends, or is it just yourself? You know, so that's going to determine what size you want, or when you're going to be tapping your trees. How much money do you have to invest in your operation? You know, are there any type of grant opportunities that exist for equipment, or for starting an operation, even small business grants, or agriculture grants that are out there? Are, you know, so if you don't want to boil sap down, are there producers nearby who could do that for you, so you don't have to invest in all that added equipment for processing? And then, you know, what are the markets in your area? You know, are there a lot of people producing maple syrup, or is there not many people near me, and there's a good market potential just locally at a farmer's market, or just selling right out of my home or sugar house, sugar camp that you have? So just some concepts. I'll leave it up there to kind of for your own self to consider. And we've got 5 minutes left, it looks like. So I'll turn it over to more questions. So you can feel free to throw that into the Q&A box like some of you already have, or if you want to raise your hand and Caitlin can give you permission to, if you don't want to type, you can feel free to ask questions in person.
I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to think about it, but I just want to also Adam had mentioned the next webinar. So the next webinar is on Wednesday night, October 25th at the same time, so 7 Atlantic Standard Time. And if you have any issues or any trouble connecting to those webinars, please contact us at Perennia. Again, I put in the chat some information on where to find some Maple resources, as well as the information for the upcoming Maple Camp and registration. And so Adam will be there in person for that on November 18th and 19th.
I've got a question from Scott asking, is there anything you can do or anything you can add to the base of the tree for the trees to enhance sap? And it's a great question. There's not tons of research on a lot of that. Obviously, having good groundwater is important for sap flow. Traditionally, during the maple sap season at the end of winter, between snowmelt and a lot of spring rains, there's usually plenty of ground moisture. I have seen, like a couple years ago, I know in our operation, we kind of went from snowmelt to no rain. And so the snow melted, the ground dried out, and it kind of got fairly dry, and our sap flow was noticeably a little bit less because of some of that, I think. So having some water, but that being said, I've never heard of anybody trying to go out and kind of irrigate the woods to help increase the sap flow at that time of the year, because traditionally that's not an issue. The other piece that comes to thinking of adding is doing some type of, you know, fertilization. I know Caitlin and I have talked about this quite a bit, different things. I've done some research, and I've done some more recently. I was actually just analyzing some of my data today and looking at, you know, nutrients that could be added to trees. And for my graduate research work, I actually found that nitrogen helped increase the sap sugar a little bit in the trees, because nitrogen is important for photosynthesis. It really depends on what your trees need. What are the soils, you know, potentially lacking in your forest? And typically those are going to be calcium most often, or calcium, and then nitrogen. Trees usually, plants always can benefit from nitrogen. In some studies have found that calcium can sometimes increase sap kind of sugars. Usually when we're thinking about nutrients, we're not usually increasing sap flow, but increasing the sap sugars, which are definitely beneficial. I have found that calcium didn't always necessarily help increase sap sugars initially within a couple of years, but calcium is definitely known. There's been lots of studies, and I think Caitlin did some work on this as well in her graduate work, looking at calcium is definitely helpful for increasing the overall health of a maple trees, and having good healthy maple trees is going to ultimately help with that sap flow. It may be a long term, you may not see that, you know, within a year or two, but that payback is definitely going to be there in the long run if your trees are healthy and continue to produce for many years. They produce bigger canopies and leaves. Sometimes when you put a nutrient on some of our trees, or even thinner trees, sometimes all of a sudden they have this, you know, kind of burst of sort of, you know, nutrients and things that allow them to all of a sudden photosynthesize more, or they're healthier, and they will not always put that into storage. They may put it more into growth. And so we may not see that sugar result right away, but the trees have grown more and they're going to be healthier in the long run. We know that's going to be better. So, I don't know, is there anything you wanted to add to that, Caitlin?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah. We have done some liming, not specifically on sugar bushes, but on the sugar maple, red maple forest in Nova Scotia. And one of the other components that we're looking at is long-term resiliency. So calcium should help increase tree health so hopefully build up resiliency for things like storms and stuff that potentially could be more frequent in the future. But I think other than that, you covered it all.
Yeah, no, that's important as well to mention, just that resiliency to be there for many years to come. There's a question from Bradley asking about, he's looking to install a dry line. Currently has a setup on 900 taps. So this is a little more advanced question for those, and we'll get into some of these topics next or on Wednesday. So he's asking whether you should add a dry line and what size. The Cornell Maple program, we actually have a tubing notebook that's on our website. If you go to cornellmaple.com, and I believe Caitlin put a link up to cornellmaple.com, that the tubing notebook has a bunch of different charts for calculating out based on the number of taps and the size of your pump that you have and how far out it's going and your slope, to calculate out the size of tubing that you need, and if you're doing a wet dry line system to help increase vacuum or keep good vacuum. But I would say you'd want, in this particular case, Bradley, would probably be fine with a 1-inch dry line, somewhere between inch and 1.25 inches, without looking at any of the charts or thinking about that. You're not going out too far, not too many trees. So 1 inch would probably be plenty. 1.25 inches would give you a little bit more cushion. And feel free to reach out to me with more specific questions about stuff like that as well. Question from Thomas: do you have any issues with the 3/16 tubing collapsing with higher tap numbers per line run? I've not noticed the 3/16 tubing ever collapsing from like too high of vacuum where it kind of flattens. And I've seen high vacuum on 3/16. That's never been an issue. I have seen if you get too many trees on a 3/16, that because 3/16 is a lot less volume than our standard 5/16, that tube can fill up, and so it can't handle as much sap. So it's actually kind of, in a sense, sort of backing up. I mean, it's continuing to flow, but there's not as much sap able to flow out of all the trees, and so the flow can actually drop off. And so I've had some people do some studies that have found that 3/16 can handle up to 40 taps, but in some of my own personal research studies, I found that once you get above like 20 trees on 3/16, when you get some good runs, it fills up and it can't handle all the sap, so it's backing up in the trees and it's not all coming out as well. So I say 20 trees or less on 3/16, and if you're getting more than 20, then go up to a 5/16 in that standpoint. But I've not had it actually flatten. It just can't handle the volume of sap that's there on your big runs. Question from Darren: is there an easier way to count trees in your property other than 1, 2, 3? Just staying there, counting each individual tree. He has 100 acres with a large amount of maple, trying to maybe do a business plan. Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple different methods. One method is to do I mean, basically both the methods you're doing a plot sampling. So one is to, I mean, you can create a kind of subplot of like a 1/10 acre or a 1/4 acre. And so traditionally you do like a 1/10 of an acre. And I always forget what the numbers are off the top of my head. I used to have a note in my desk, but I don't think I do right now. That tells you how the radius, if you basically put a stake in the ground and stretched a rope out as a radius, I think for like a 1/4 acre, it's 60 some feet or something like that. And if you spin that in a circle and then counted all the trees that you had within that circle, and then did that maybe 5 to 10 times throughout your 100 acres, getting in different diversity, different types. And then you can use that to kind of extrapolate out that, say, within a 1/4 acre, you had 20 trees, or you just did a 1/10 of an acre, and maybe you had 8 trees, one had 10. And you can average that out, which your average is for a 1/10 of an acre, and then multiply that out for your total forest to give you a pretty close. It'll obviously it's an average, it's an estimate, but it'll be very close for you. The hard part about that, the issue with that is, if you imagine trying to stretch out a 50 or 60 foot rope in a woods and trying to spin that, then you're going to hit a tree, and then you got to pull that rope all the way back to the center point and then spin around. So if you can kind of guesstimate within that length, is one method. Or another method is to do a point sampling. And a point sampling is what foresters typically do, where we use what's called a prism or an angle gauge that allows you, hold on a second.
Just while he's looking for that, there was another question that I answered by typing. So they asked where the Maple Camp was, and it's at the Debert Hospitality Center in Debert, Nova Scotia.
Right. Thanks, Caitlin. This is an angle gauge. It's a simple, just flat piece of plastic. These we developed to give out to landowners. It has this box in here, and this opening is about the size. Well, Canada, you don't have pennies anymore, right? But if you still have a penny around, it's about the width of my thumb. If I stick my thumb in there, it's about the same width. We say a penny if you can still find a penny. I have a US dime here that's smaller. You hold these 25 inches from your eye, and you can then, this box is actually designed at this width, that if you hold this 25 inches from your eye and spin in a circle, and if you hold this up to a tree, and if a tree completely fills the box, then you count that as yes, it's in, and then you need to measure the diameter, and then there's a form that goes with it that you can calculate out your tapping density. And it's a really, really fast way once you learn how to do this. And it's a fairly accurate way to estimate. I know that probably doesn't make any sense in trying to explain this. I could send you a couple of videos and the worksheet for actually going through this. So if you wanted, like I said, your thumb is actually pretty good. So if your thumb completely covers the tree, you're holding that 25 inches from your eye, you'd count that as in, and then there's a multiplying factor, and it's all based on kind of math and thinking about the mathematical shadow. Larger trees have a bigger shadow. Even if they're farther away, they're still counted in. Smaller trees, if they're close enough, could still be counted. So if you're interested in that, Darren, feel free to send me an email, and I could forward on the worksheet for that and some videos that explain how to do it. So bottom line, yes, there are some ways to do it. And if you're coming to the in-person in November, we can explain how to do it there in person. I could bring some of these angle gauges to hand out as well if you'd like.
Great. Yeah, we're about 10 minutes over time, so I think we'll end it there. But thank you so much, Adam, and we will see you again on Wednesday.
Sounds great. Have a great night, everyone.